How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Zayin, Daf 117 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 117 is exciting because we wrap up Perek Kol HaBasar, the Perek we've been working on for the past 2 weeks, learning all about Basar B'chalev. We are going to wrap up Perek Kol HaBasar, and we are going to begin Perek HaOr VeHarotev. So in terms of wrapping up Kol HaBasar, we are going to learn a new Mishnah comparing chelev and blood, where they are more stringent and more lenient than the other. And that is going to take us to the end of Perek Kol HaBasar. We will then begin the next Perek, Perek HaOr VeHarotev. As I've said in the past, I'm both excited and cautious about Perek HaOr VeHarotev. I'm excited because it talks all about Tumas Ochlin, Tumas Nevela. These are topics that they kind of come up in like their own kind of bubbles often in Shas, so we don't necessarily interact with Tumah and Tara all that often, which is probably a good thing because they are very tricky and difficult subjects. But here we have a perek to learn all about Tumah and Tara, so we have an opportunity here to do a bit of a deep dive into Tumah and Tara, specifically Tumas Ochlin, Tumas Nevelos, though I am cautious because those tend to be tricky subjects. So we are going to begin Perek HaOr VeHarotev today, which, as I said, I am cautiously excited about. We'll have a little bit of an introduction to it. And also, as I mentioned before, Perek Kol Basar, that once we began Perek Kol Basar, there were like 3 2-week sprints remaining in Masechta Chullin, the third largest Masechta in Shas, according to my estimation. With the completion of Perek Kol Basar, we finished the first of those sprints, which means that ahead of us are 2 more 2-week sprints. The first one being HaOr VeHarotev, which is roughly 2 weeks. So this is exciting. We are making our way through Masechta Chullin with now the beginning of HaOr VeHarotev. Once we complete HaOr VeHarotev, we are mamish at the final stretch. So I'm very excited about Daf Yud Zayin of Masechta Chullin. Come join me and let's have a great time studying Daf Yud Zayin, Daf 117 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin Daf Kuf Tes Zayin, Amid Beis, all the way at the bottom, last line of the Amid. Chomer b'chelev mi ba'adam v'chomer ba'adam mi b'chelev. There are stringencies with chelev that do not exist by blood, and there are stringencies by blood that do not exist by chelev. This was actually kind of funny because after learning all about Basar B'chalev for the last 2 weeks, I was reading this Mishnah. I was like, Chomer b'chalev mi ba'adam. Like, I was like trying to figure out what does milk have to do with blood. Like, until I realized, like, wait, it's not chalev, it's chelev. Which is funny that, that I was so in chalav mode that I was trying to understand what does chalav have to do with anything, and it's chelev of korbanos. Is actually a bit of a kodshemi kind of topic. Wow, Chaver, this past year has been a trip and a half, huh? We're almost coming up to Rosh Hashanah. This past year has been a trip and a half. This past year was entirely zvachim, minochas, and chulin. That is a challenging year. And with Chullin, in my opinion, has been fantastic. A little bit of a break from the purely kodshemi korbanos stuff, which we're going to be getting back into soon enough with Masechta Bechoros. Anyways, so this is like a shtickle of a korbani kind of thing. We're going to talk about pigul, noser, tameh. Woo! It's been a while. Well, Chaver, Masechta Zvachim, I think, is the only Masechta in all of Shas. It's possible at one point I was like this with Yavamis, was like this for me, maybe. I don't think so, though. Zvachim, if I see in a Tosfos or something, or I see in a Gemara that we're quoting something from Zvachim, I like freeze up. I like stiffen up. Zvachim was like a shocker, like a complete, I'm not over it yet. We've moved on from Zvachim, but Zvachim has not moved on from me. So like anything related to Zvachim, I'm still like, oh wait, that's going to be really hard. Like automatic, just like jerk reactions. Like, oh, that's from Zvachim. Oh, that's probably really, really difficult. I don't think I have that relationship with any other Masechta in Shas. As I said, maybe it was like that at Yavamis at one point, but this is, I think that Zvachim is more extreme. Zvachim is really something else. There are stringencies by chelev over blood, v'chomer b'adam, and by chelev, and there are stringencies of blood more so than chelev. Chomer b'chelev, the stringency by chelev. She'achelev ma'alin bay. There's a din me'ilah when it comes to chelev. So, for example, if you do zrikas adam on so let's say you shecht a korban shlamim, and you do zrikas hadam, and now you have to burn the chelev, the emurim. So there's a din me'ilah by the chelev, so and by all the emurim, so you have to burn them. So if you eat that chelev, so there would be a din me'ilah. If you do it by accident, you have to bring an asher me'ilos. V'chayav and olav mishum pigol noser v'tamei. And if you have, this is like real zvachim stuff. Like, wow. Pigol noser v'tamei is like a phrase that we just throw it around. Pigol noser v'tamei. Each one is like olam lo. So pigol, for example, if you shecht let's say a kohen shechts a korban chatas with the intention of eating what does he even get? He gets the chaz of a what are the parts of the? Oh no, he gets all the meat of the korban chatas. Oh wow, I'm rusty. Right, with the intention to eat the meat chutz zmano, let's say the next day. So then the korban is pigol, and if you eat the chelev of that korban, you'll be chayiv for pigol. V'nosor, if it's left over to the next day and you eat it, you'll be chayiv for nosor v'tamei. Or if you're tamei when eating, I don't know if I said pigol, but when eating the chelev, right? So you be chayiv chelev. You be chayiv for pigol by eating chelev, or chayiv kares for noser by eating chelev, or for being in a state of tumah when eating chelev. Mashen came b'dam. None of these, however, apply to blood. V'chom b'dam, and there is a stringency by blood. She'adam noig b'beim v'chayiv of the isser against blood. Now the Rambam actually says in, I don't remember. I don't know. Maybe Psulei Mukdashin says that when it comes to blood, I mean, it's not a big chiddush. I think he just writes it clearly that when it comes to blood, there's only ever going to be an isser against eating blood. There won't be any other thing, like we said, me'ilah, pigol, noser, etc. When it comes to blood, the isser is going to be strictly the fact that you're eating blood. Now, that isser of eating blood, noeg ba behema b'chayiv v'of. It applies whether we're talking about behemas, chayas, oafs, bein tmeim, bein taharim, whether kosher, whether not kosher. That isser of blood is going to apply against eating, the prohibition against eating blood. Whereas v'chelev ein noeg elo b'behemat tahor b'vad. Whereas chelev, on the other hand, is only a thing by kosher animals. As we know, chayas, oafis, they don't have chelev. So chelev is more limited in that way that it is limited to chayas. Says the Gemara Menanimili, how do we know that there is a din of me'ilah when it comes to chelev, and that din me'ilah is across the board, kachim, or even kachim kalim? How do you know that there's a din me'ilah by the chelev of kachim kalim? So Amar Reb Yanis says that the pasuk says by par koyin Mashiach. I'm telling you, unbelievable. The kachim that is coming up on this daf, par koyin Mashiach. Sheesh, these are sugyas from Horius. These are sugyas from Zvachim. Reb Neil might remember these sugyas. Right? It comes up. This kind of limud comes up in. Oh boy, was it Lamed min Alamim b'Kachim? I think that right. Ein Lamed Lamed min Alamim b'Kachim. I think that was one of Reb Neil's sugyas possibly. As we all know, Reb Neil has his sugyas. I think that's one of them. I always forget if it's exactly it or an adjacent sugya. So Menan Emili Amar Reb Yanai the Amar Kra Kasher Yurim Shazevach Hashlamim by the Par Kohen Mashiach. So if a Kohen Gadol sins, he doesn't bring a regular korban chatas like all the other people. He brings a par kohen Mashiach, which is one of the parim on Esrafim. There are certain emurim that are going to be burnt on the mizbeach hachitzon, but otherwise everything goes out to the Beis HaSreifa and is burnt there. Anyways, so it says by the par kohen Mashiach, kasher yura mishar zevach hashlamim, that all of the emurim that there are by a par zevach hashlamim, by a shlamim cow, those same emurim are going to be burnt by a par kohen Mashiach. The only peculiarity there is that by a par kohen Mashiach, it actually lists all the emurim that need to be offered. So really, by saying kasher yurim mishor zevach hashlamim really doesn't add anything, because the Torah already listed what needs to be emurimmed by the par kohen Mashiach. I understand if the Torah didn't tell us what needs to be emurimmed from the par kohen Mashiach and just says kasher yurim mishor zevach hashlamim. Well, it's the same emurim as a par zevach hashlamim, a shlamim cow. Okay, I don't know what emurim. It's the same ones as the shlamim cow. But by par kohen Mashiach, it did list all of the emurim. So why say then the zevach hashlamim? So v'chima lomadnu mishor zevach hashlamim. What are we learning out from the Zevach HaShlamim if we already listed all the emurim by Par Kohen Mashiach? Me'ata areze bod lilamed v'nimtza lamed. So on the surface, it would seem that the Zevach HaShlamim here by the Par Kohen Mashiach is coming to teach us something about the Par Kohen Mashiach, right? Kasher yurim mishar Zevach HaShlamim, that just like the Par Zevach HaShlamim, we're going to apply that same thing to the Par Kohen Mashiach. The question is, what is it that we're applying? It turns out actually, it's actually the opposite. Joke's on you. It's not that Zevach HaShlamim is teaching us about Par Kohen Mashiach. It's quite the contrary. Par Kohen Mashiach is actually teaching us something about Zevach HaShlamim. What is that? Makish Shor Zevach HaShlamim le Par Kohen Mashiach, that we compare a Shlamim, a regular Kachim Kalim, to the Par Kohen Mashiach. Ma Par Kohen Mashiach yesh bo me'ilah. Just like Par Kohen Mashiach, there is a me'ilah. There's a din me'ilah. It's kachay kachim, there's a din me'ilah, and that din me'ilah applies to all of the emurim as well. So af shor zevach hashlamim. So also when it comes to an ox of a shlamim, yesh bo me'ilah, there's a din me'ilah by all of its emurim as well. That there's a din me'ilah by all of the emurim by zevach hashlamim, and that of course includes chelev, that includes the chelev, the forbidden fats, by a korban shlamim, which is kachim kalim. So we see that there's a din me'ilah by chelev, even by kachim kalim. Reb Chanina says to Reb Yanai, Ki'urazo Shoshana Rebbe, Reb Yanai, what's wrong with the brisa that Rebbe taught to teach us that the emurim of a korban shlamim have a din me'ilah? Wow, this is insane. It's mamish kachim. I have to weigh every single word that comes out of my mouth to make sure if I'm saying the right word. Kachim kalim, kachay kachim, shlamim, par kohen Mashiach, emurim, chelev. This is kachim. Unbelievable. So Reb Chanina says to Reb Yanai, Ki'urizo Shoshana Rebbe, what do you have what's wrong with the brisa that Rebbe taught? Kol chelev la'Hashem, that when the pasuk says by korban shlamim, kol chelev la'Hashem, that all the chelev is to the Rabbeinu Shalom. It's for the Rabbeinu Shalom. It's not for us. L'rabos emuri kachim kalim me'ilah, to teach that the emurim of kachim kalim, of a korban shlamim, for example, have a din of me'ilah. Simple as that. Why do you have to learn it out from Par Kohen Mashiach? Rabbi says, Abai itztich, you need Par Kohen Mashiach. Because of Rachmana Kol Chelev, if we only had the pasuk by a korban shlamim of Kol Chelev, Hava Amina Chelev in your says v'shtei. The pasuk of Kol Chelev, I may have thought only teaches us about Chelev, that there's a din me'ilah by the chelev of a korban shlamim. How do I know that there's also a din me'ilah by the diaphragm, by the kidneys, by the other emurim? So in your says v'shtei, so because v'achmana kasher yuram, that's why we have the comparison to the Par Kohen Mashiach, where there's a din me'ilah by all of the emurim, and we apply that back to korban shlamim to say that there's a din me'ilah by all of the emurim of a korban shlamim, not just the chelev. Because of Rachmana kasher yuram, and if all we would have is the pasuk by Par Kohen Mashiach, have a amina, skip to the next word, al ya delesa bishor lo, So if all we're learning out is from Par Kohen Mashiach, the thing is, Par Kohen Mashiach is a par, is a cow. A cow doesn't have an aliyah that is offered as part of the emurim. So what about a shlamim that is a sheep? Would there be a din me'ilah by its aliyah? We wouldn't know from the Par Kohen Mashiach because there's no aliyah that's offered on the mizbeach as part of the emurim by Par Kohen Mashiach. And the aliyah is only right as offered on the mizbeach for a sheep. So because of Achmana, kol chelev, that is why we need the pasuk by Korban Shlomim that says kol chelev, and as Rashi points out that there is a pasuk that says, let's see, can I find it? Because of Achmana kol chelev ashkachon aliyah de ikri chelev, and we see that I'm reading Rashi. It says because of Achmana kol chelev, and we see that the aliyah is called chelev. Tichsev chelbo ha'aliyah tmima. So we see chelbo ha'aliyah, that aliyah is referred to as chelev, chelbo ha'aliyah. So therefore, when we have this pasuk by a korban shlomim that says kol chelev, it's coming to include all chelev, including the aliyah. The aliyah is considered chelev, like it says kol chelev ha'aliyah. Okay, great. So we need both of these psukim, kol chelev by shlomim, as well as kasher yuram mishor zevach hashlamim, which is by Par Kohen Mashiach. Okay. Says of Mar to Zvid, if it's true, like we said, that aliyah is called chelev, hachelev ha'aliyah, aliyah is called chelev, titzur b'achila, well then it should be also to eat the aliyah. Now it's mutter to eat the aliyah. Kilu, from a korban, it's also because it's part of the emurim you have to offer on the mizbeach. However, if you were to shecht a sheep, so the aliyah would be mutter. You're allowed to eat the aliyah, but you're not allowed to eat chelev. So if it's true that it says chelev ha'aliyah, and therefore aliyah is a type of chelev, so therefore when it says kol chelev by shlomim, it's to include the aliyah and din me'ilah, da. So if aliyah is chelev, it should be forbidden to be eaten. Amalei, so Rav Zvid responds to Rav Mari Alecha Amar Kol, well the pasuk says kol chelev. Right, when the pasuk says kol chelev lo sochelu, it says kol chelev shorva kesef va'ez. Oxen, sheep, goats, davra shove b'shorva kesef va'ez. The chelev that is that's usher to be eaten, that's forbidden to be eaten, is chelev that is consistent. Maybe is a word that can be used. That is consistent among cows, sheep, goats. Aliyah is only offered for sheep, not for cows and goats. So when it says kol chelev lo sochelu, it's forbidding only chelev that is offered on the mizbeach that is shared among cows, sheep, and goats. Aliyah is specific to sheep. Okay, so therefore you're allowed to eat the aliyah, just not when it's a sheep korban. Chelbo, so Amar, fine. Rav Ashi Omar, I hope I didn't skip anything. Rav Ashi Omar says, Rav Ashi Chelbo ha'alya ikre chelev stamalo ikre. Alternatively, says Rav Ashi that the alya isn't technically, by default a chelev. It's not referred to as just chelev. It's chelbo ha'alya. You won't refer to aliyah as strictly speaking as chelev. It would be chelbo ha'alya, chelev stamaloki, but you wouldn't refer to it as just plain chelev. And therefore, the isser of achilas chelev applies to something that, if you say chelev, it refers to that. That doesn't include the aliyah. Stam chelev doesn't include the aliyah. The aliyah, if you're going to refer to it as chelev, it's chelev ha'aliyah, not just chelev. You wouldn't refer to it as chelev alone. Elamiyata, if that's the case, lo yim alu ba. Well, if we're saying that chelev, right, doesn't include the aliyah, well then, if the isser of chelev by me'ilah should exclude the aliyah, ela machvada kedur of zvid, it's more like Rosvid, right? So meaning, because we're saying that if we're saying that aliyah, strictly speaking, is in chelev, so when it says kol chelev, then that wouldn't include the aliyah, which is chelev aliyah. So therefore, we say, scratch that mahalach. Let's just go with Rav Zvid's mahalach, that the reason why you're allowed to eat the aliyah is because the forbidden chelevs are the chelevs that are consistent among cows, sheep, and goat, whereas the aliyah as a murim is unique to sheep. Givaldi. Okay, so we just learned all about the chelev and the din me'ilah by chelev, and how that din me'ilah applies both to kachim as well as kachim kalim, and it refers to all the emurim of kachim kalim as well. Mashenkin badam, the Mishnah had said, now when it comes to blood, however, there is no din me'ilah. How do we know that there's no din me'ilah by blood? Amar Ula says, Ula Damakra, that the pasuk says lachem, that the pasuk says by blood. I'll read you the pasuk. Ki nefesh abasur badami, who he, that the soul of the flesh is in the blood. Vani nasativ lachem, I gave it to you. Al mizbeach lichaper, as atonement. Anaf shosechem ki adam hu vanefesh yichaper. So in that pasuk, we're going to learn three things from that pasuk. So it says Ula Damakra lachem shalachem yeh. The pasuk says Vani nasativ lachem, it's yours. There's no din me'ilah. There's no isser of me'ilah. It's yours. That same pasuk says l'chaper nasativ lo leme'ilah. I gave it to you. I gave you the blood for atonement. Right? It's thrown on the mizbeach to atone. It's for atonement. It's not for a me'ilah. The isser me'ilah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra, who, that the pasuk says ki adam hu banefesh yichaper, hu lifnei kapara, kilachar kapara, that blood is prior to the kapara in the same capacity as it is post atonement. Malachar kapara ein bo me'ilah, af lifnei kapara ein bo me'ilah. Just like post atonement, there would be no din me'ilah by the blood. So also pre atonement, there's no din me'ilah by the blood of a korban. Ve'ema hu la'achar kapara klifnei kapara. Let's say it's the opposite, that blood post-atonement is like blood pre-atonement, and let's say ma lifnei kapara yesh me'ilah af la'achar kapara yesh bo me'ilah. Let's say that just like before atonement there is actually a din of me'ilah, and we'll say that for consistency after atonement there's also a din me'ilah. Let's say that there is din me'ilah by blood. Says the Gemara, no, that can't be, because ein l'chadav shenaisim mitzvah me'alim bo. There is no such concept as a mitzvah that has already been completed. You're already, right, the blood has already done its part. You did the zrikas adam. It's done its part. Me'ilah is gone. I mean, even if there was a din me'ilah of blood, it would only be until the mitzvah has been done with it. There's no such concept as the mitzvah have already been completed, and yet there's still a din me'ilah. Once the mitzvah is completed, any din me'ilah, any prohibition against getting benefit is no longer. And therefore, it's impossible to say that just like there is a din me'ilah before the kapara, before the zrikas adam, there's also din me'ilah after the zrikas adam. After the zrikas adam, there's definitely no din me'ilah. So rather, it's going to have to be the limit in reverse, that just like there's no din me'ilah post zrikas adam, who, for consistency, there's also no din me'ilah even before zrikas adam. Vilo, 1 second, is this really such a hard, fast rule that ein l'chadav shnaisim mitzvah m'alimbo, that there's no such concept as the mitzvah already being done, and yet there's a lingering din of Isser Me'ilah? Impossible. Vare Chuma Sadeshin. What about Chuma Sadeshin? Denaisim mitzvah mu'alimbo. What's Chuma Sadeshin? I'll give you a second to think about it while I take a shluck of tea. Chuma Sadeshin was the first avoda that was done in the Beis HaMikdash every day. Even before dawn even. Was it before dawn or before sunrise? I think maybe even before dawn. Anyways, it was the first avodah that was done in the Beis HaMikdash. We're going to learn about it in Masechta Talmud. We're going to learn Masechta Talmud probably in about 6 months from now. Now, Chuma Sadeshin, a kohen would go to the top of the Mizbeach, he would take a scoop of the ash from the top of the Mizbeach, just a scoop, and he would bring it back down and put it next to the Mizbeach. That was Chuma Sadeshin. So the Chsiv, it says, V'samu eitz ha-Mizbeach, so Varei Chuma Sadeshin denaisim mitzvah mu'alimbo, that even after the mitzvah of Chuma Sadeshin is done, there's still din me'ilah. The Chsiv is supposed to say, V'samu eitz ha-Mizbeach, that the Kohen goes to the top of the Mizbeach, takes a scoop of ashes, brings it down from the Mizbeach and puts it, V'samo eitz Mizbeach, he puts it next to the Mizbeach and you leave it there. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. You're not allowed to get benefit from it. You're not allowed to nothing it. It just kind of disappears there in its place. So we see that even after the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen has been completed, there is still a din me'ilah. So apparently we have an example of something that even after the mitzvah is done, there is still a din me'ilah. So it sounds like this flies in the face of our concept. And it apparently, even after the mitzvah is done, you can have a din me'ilah. And for the Gemara, Mishum Davai Trumas Hadeshen ubigdei kehuna. Well, Trumas Hadeshen is not the only example. There is one other example. Shucks. Right? As they say in computer programming, the hardest things are like caching and one-off errors. I think that's what they say. Because when something's off by one, it's like on the one hand, it's like, oh, well, it's only off by one. We basically have it, right? No. Unless it's perfect, it is completely wrong. If it should not be off by one. If it's off by one, it may as well be off by a million. It's completely broken. So here also, right? If I don't know where I'm getting, why am I saying that? Yeah. I mean, I think it's basically the same concept. If you have one example of something, so then as we know, right? So then we can say, okay, just like it's example here, it's example everywhere. But if you have one more example, then it kind of throws off the whole thing. I don't know if that was why did I think to compare it to one-off errors? The point is, I don't know. So, because you have one other example, because having one other example basically ruins the whole concept. If you would only have, right, as we know, if you'd only have Trumas Hadeshen as an example of Davar Shenaisim Mitzvosim Me'alim, so we could say, well, just like by Trumas Hadeshen, you can have a din me'ilah after the mitzvah is done. So clearly, in general, there's a concept of being able to have a din me'ilah after the mitzvah has been done. But once you have one more example, all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, this is not right. If we'd apply it everywhere, then just have one place to learn it from there. Now that we have two examples, we say, it's limited to those two examples and nowhere else. It's the suspicious element, right? It's like, why is it only in these two places? Seemingly, it should only be in these two places and nowhere else. And you can't learn from other places. What's the big day kahuna? Big day kahuna is that on Yom Kippur, we learned about this in Masechta Yoma. On Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol does the Seder Hayom, the korbanos that have to be done in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Ketores, the Par V'Sar of Yom Kippur. So those are done in Big Day Lavan. In that, right? Usually, of course, the Kohen Gadol serves in the Shmona Begadim, which has gold on it. On Yom Kippur, only the Big Day Lavan, the four garments of a Kohen Hedjit. Now, so it says there, as we're going to see in a minute, it says V'nicham Sham. That once he takes them off for the final time, he just leaves them there, never to be used again, and there's a din me'ilah. So we see that even though the mitzvah, you've already used the clothing, there is still a din me'ilah. So both by Trumas Hadeshen and by Big Day Kahuna, the four garments of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, even after the avodah has been done, there's still a din me'ilah. And whenever you have two examples of something, it's limited to only those two. You can't apply it broadly. So that makes sense. If you hold that way, that makes sense. What way? If you hold like the Rabbanan, that when the pasuk says v'nicham sham, that the Kohen Gadol leaves his white garments there, it means you have to bury it. You have to get rid of them. They can no longer be used again. Okay, so we see that after the avodah has been done, there's still a din of me'ilah. However, if you remember from Masechta Sota, from Masechta Yom, it's a machlokes. Reb Dosa's opinion is you can't use these Big Day Lavan for another Yom Kippur, but a Kohen Hedjit can use them for the rest of the year. So there's no din me'ilah when it comes to these garments. So if there's no din me'ilah by Big Day Kahuna, according to Reb Dosa, well then there's really only one example of having a din me'ilah after the mitzvah has been done. That is Trumas Hadeshen. So let's say that just like by Trumas Hadeshen, there is a din me'ilah post mitzvah. Let's say That's the same case in general. And for the Gemara, no, Mishum Da'avoy, Chumas Hadeshin ve'egla arufa, Shnei Ksuvin Aboyin, Ke'echad v'chol Shnei Ksuvin Aboyin, Ke'echad im lamdin. Because Chumas Hadeshin and Egla Arufa, by Egla Arufa, of course, you find a corpse between hither and yon. You don't know who did it. So it's a whole ceremony, as we learned about the other week in Parshas Shoftim at the very end. And they take a calf and they hack it in the back of the neck, and it dies, and you can't get any benefit from it. You have to leave it. So we see that even after the mitzvah, even after the egla, its neck has been hacked with an axe or with a machete, you leave it there. There is a din me'ilah even after the mitzvah has been done. And since we have Chumas Hadeshin and Egla Arufa, which are Shnei Ksuvin Aboyin Ke'echad, you cannot apply it broadly to say that there's a din me'ilah post mitzvah. However, of course, as we know, that's just one opinion, that when you have Shnei Ksuvin Aboyin Ke'echad, two examples of something, it's limited to those two examples. You can't apply it broadly. However, but it's a machlokes. According to others, you can say, just like it applies to these two opinions, in our case, Chumas Hadeshin and Egla Arufa, let's apply it broadly. So let's say that there is a din me'ilah post mitzvah. Well, it says by Chumas Hadeshin, V'samo, you will place it. By Egla Arufa, it says, Ha Arufa, the Egla Arufa, limiting the din of me'ilah to Egla Arufa, i.e., even though there's a din of me'ilah by Chumas Hadeshin and by Egla Arufa post Asiyas HaMitzvah, it is limited to those two cases. Samo, place it. Ha Arufa, this specific Egla Arufa, there's a din me'ilah post mitzvah, but in general, there would be no din me'ilah post mitzvah, and therefore by blood, once the Zrikas Adam is done, there's no longer din me'ilah. And when it says who, according to Rabbi Yochanan, so it's for consistency, that just like there's no din me'ilah after Zrikas Adam, there's also no din me'ilah even before Zrikas Adam. In fact, why do I need three limitations when it comes to blood? Right? We had seen Ula had focused on lachem. Tanit Rabbi Shmuel had focused on the chaper. Rabbi Yochanan had focused on who. Why do I need three words like that in the pasuk? Answers the Gemara. So we'll frek the Gemara. Why by blood do I need these three words really in the pasuk? Chad lemute minoser. One is to exclude noser, as we learned in the Mishnah, that by blood, if you eat blood that was left over to the next day, you'll be chai for eating blood, but not for noser. V'chad lemute mi me'ilah, that there's no din me'ilah. V'chad lemute mi tuma, and one to exclude from tuma. If you eat blood in a state of tuma, you'll be chai for eating blood, but not for eating tamei she'achal es hakodesh. Aval mi pigol l'tzarikra, I don't need a pasuk to exclude blood from pigol, because it's excluded from pigol conceptually. The Tanan is learned in a Mishnah in the fourth parak of Masechet Zvachim, kol sheyesh lo matirin, anything that becomes mutar, bein la'adam, bein la'mizbeach, whether for people, whether for the mizbeach, chayav and olav mishum pigol, you're chayav for pigol. So meaning, for example, the meat of a korban chatas, let's say, you're not allowed to eat the kohen is not allowed to eat the meat of a korban chatas, but once the zrikas adam for the korban chatas is done, now it becomes mutter. The meat becomes mutter. Or the emurim. You're not allowed to burn the emurim of the korban chatas, let's say, on the mizbech until after zrikas adam. So the emurim, the meat, these are things that become mutter. Things that become mutter are shaykh to the isser of pigol. So therefore, if the kohen shechs the korban chatas with the intention of, doing zrikas adam tomorrow or something, so then what is going to apply to pigol? The meat, the emurim, but blood doesn't apply to pigol because blood does not become mutter. Vidam gufe materu. The blood is the one that is matir other things. You do the zrikas adam, now the meat becomes mutter. Now the emurim can be burnt on the mizbeach. But the blood never becomes mutter. It makes other things mutter. It itself doesn't become mutter. And pigol only applies to things that become mutter, like the meat, like the emurim. But there's no memela, inherently there's not going to be a din of pigul by blood, therefore we don't need a pasuk for it. Hadron olach kol habasar. We'll come back to Perek kol habasar. Okay, friends, now we begin the Perek of Ha'or V'Harotev. As I said in the introduction, I'm very excited about Perek Ha'or V'Harotev, but also very cautious. But more excited than cautious. I would like to do a little brief introduction before we learn the first Mishnah of Ha'or V'Harotev. Ha'or V'Harotev is going to discuss Tumas Ochlin as well as Tumas Nevela. Tumas Ochlin is the Tuma of food. And as we've learned, in order for food, let's say we're talking about an apple, and let's say we're talking about a dead sheretz. A dead sheretz falls on an apple. A dead sheretz is an avatuma. The apple will now be a rishon latuma. Now, in order for that apple to contract tumas ochlin, right, to become tameh, it would have to, of course, have come into contact with the 7 liquids that we have discussed in the past in the context of machshirin, tumas ochlin. That is, those 7 liquids are yad, shachat, dam is their acronym. Let's see if I could remember them without taking too much time. The yud for yad would be yayin, dalad is dvash, shachat, shin is shemen, ches is cholav, tes is tal, dam would be, we already said dvash, I think, so dam would be, we said dvash, right? Oh, well, dam, but dalad would be dam, and mem would be mayim. Those are the 7 liquids. So if this apple comes in contact, right, once it's already been picked from the tree, it comes in contact with one of the 7 liquids, and we had the first Mishnah, Masechet Machshir, we've talked about it a little bit, there has to be some kind of intention, whatever it is, the apple comes in contact with one of the 7 liquids, and now it's Mukhshir Likabel Tuma. Great. How big does that apple need to be in order to contract Tuma? Does it have to have a certain minimum size? The answer is no. To contract Tuma, the apple, you can even have just a tiny amount of apple, it will contract Tuma. Midoraisa or Midorabonim? It's machlokas. According to the Rambam, even the smallest amount of apple will contract Tuma Midoraisa. According to Tosfos and tomorrow's daf, it would only be Midorabonim. Kilu, in order for it to contract Tuma Midoraisa, it would have to be a kebeya, the size of an egg. But nonetheless, even less than that would still be Tameh, at least on a Derabanan level. Okay, that's in terms of contracting Tuma. So essentially, and this is what's important for us, is that in order for food to contract Tumas Ochlin, any amount of food can contract Tumas Ochlin. However, this is important, to transmit Tumas Ochlin to something else. So let's say a dead sheretz, which is an avatuma, touches an apple and makes that apple a rishon latuma, and that apple now touches an orange. So in order for that orange to now be a sheni latuma, the apple would have to be at least the size of an egg, a kebeya. Now most apples, I imagine, are, if it's a full apple, it would be a kebeya. It would be the size of an egg. However, the important thing is that there is a minimum amount, a minimum size for something to transmit tuma, for food to transmit tuma to other foods. And that is the size of an egg. So as long as the apple is the size of an egg, if it touches an orange, the orange will be tummy. If the apple is less than the size of an egg, it can't transmit tuma to that orange. One more thing that I wanted to in terms of tumas ochlin, so food, chulin, maxes out at a sheni latuma. So as we said, if the sheretz is a rishon latuma and it touches the apple becomes, if the sheretz is an avatuma, it touches the apple becomes a rishon latuma, the apple touches the orange becomes a sheni latuma. If the orange touches a banana, that banana is tahor, because a sheni cannot make a shlishi by ochlin. Now, if that banana was truma, that's a different story. Truma becomes a shlishi puzzle, fine. But if we're talking about chulin, it maxes out at a sheni latuma. Great. And finally, the last thing I want to say, so what have we said so far? In terms of hechsher, right, in order for the apple to become tameh, it has to come in contact with one of the liquids, mukhshir l'kabel tuma. food can become tameh at any size. To transmit tuma, it needs to be a kebeya. And finally, if we take a look at the orange, for example, so the fruit of the orange is what's inside the orange peel. It's being protected by the orange peel. So the fruit is inside the orange peel. The orange peel is protecting the fruit. The orange peel, which is protecting, is called a shomer. A shomer can also contract and transmit tumah. So if the apple touches the orange and it's still in its peel, even though the fruit isn't directly coming in contact with the apple, its peel is, that's enough, right? If the shomer comes into contact with the tumah, the fruit will be tameh. And also, if the orange is let's say rishon the tumah and touches something else, even though it's only the peel of the orange, it can transmit tumah as well. And going hand in hand, no pun intended, with shomer is a yad, a hand, a handle. So an apple, for example, has a stem on it. The stem of the apple would be considered a yad, which, like the shomer, if the dead shards touches the stem of the apple, or if the orange touches the stem of the apple, tumah will be contracted and transmitted via the stem, via the yad. So that is a bit of a introduction here to Tumas Ochlin, to Perek or Varotev. Just quickly, we talked about being mukhshel lekabel tumah via water, contracting tumah at any size, transmitting tumah at the size of a kibetza, and we also mentioned the shomer and the yadayim, the yados, when it comes to tumah. And now we are ready to learn the first Mishnah of Perek Haor Varotev. Says the Mishnah, Haor, when it comes to hide of meat of an animal, Varotev, and gravy. Okay, let's go weiter. V'akipa va'olo v'atzomas v'agidin v'akanayim v'atlafayim mitztarfin l'tamei tumas ochlin avalo tumas nevelos. Conjoined to make tumas ochlin without tumas nevelos. What does that mean? So as we discussed now in the introduction, that there's a minimum size of a kibeya in order to transmit tumas ochlin. Now, so therefore, what if you have meat and that meat is less than the size of a kibeya? So it will be unable to transmit tumas ochlin. But what if the meat still has the hide? It's connected to its hide. Now, hide in and of itself is not considered ochlin and can't contract and transmit tumas ochlin. But if the hide is still attached to the meat, so even though there's less than a kebeya of meat, but if you include the hide in the cheshbon, there is a kebeya. It is the size of an egg. So we're saying that haor, the hide, mitzdarf in the time of tumas ochlin, can join to make so that there's a kebeya to be able for this meat to now be able to transmit tumas ochlin. We say avalo tumas nevelos, but not for nevela. Now nevela, if you have an animal, let's say a sheep dropped dead, so that animal is nevela. A kezayis of a nevela transmits tumas nevela. What if you have less than a kezayis, but you still have but you have some hide connected to, and then with the hide it's a kezayis. So we say avalo tumas nevelos. No, the hide joins together to create a kebeya for tumas ochlin, but not the kezayis for nevela, for tumas nevela. Let's start again. Haor. So in terms of hide, varot of any gravy on the meat that may have congealed. Now gravy alone, this congealed gravy on its own would not be considered ochlin and would not be metame tumas ochlin. But as connected to the meat, it can join together with the meat to create that kibeya. Ve'akipa, or spices. Ve'alol, the Rashi says, we'll get into what the olol is in the Gemara. Ve'atzomas, bones. What's interesting about a bone is that inside a bone there is marrow, and the marrow is considered ochel. So in terms of the kibeya of marrow, the bone would be considered a shomer, a protector, like the peel of an orange. The bone is considered a shomer for the marrow and would be included in the cheshbon of a kibeya. The agidin, sinews, vakarnayim, horns, specifically the softer part of the horns closer to the head, that's lafayim, hooves, mitzdarfin, can all join together with meat, the tami tumas ochlin, in order to transmit tumas ochlin at the size of a kibeya. Avalo tumas nevelos, but not to transmit nevela tuma at the size of a kazayas. Kayotzebo, and similarly, another example where there would be tumas ochlin but not tumas nevelos. Hashoiched behema tmea le'oved kechavim umifarkeses. Interesting. So when it comes to a kosher animal, let's say a sheep, if a yid does a proper shchita on a sheep for another yid, so everything is kosher about this, a yid doing a proper shchita on a sheep for another yid. So we say that once the shchita is complete, once you've sliced more than halfway to the trachea and the esophagus, the shchita is complete. And even if the sheep is now flipping, and even if the sheep is now flopping, the shchita is complete. It's already done. As we learned earlier in the Masechta, at least once, I think, that maybe you would want it, there's some value in, like, at that point quickly having some of the, I think, meat from the base of shchita or something. Even though it's still flipping and it's still flopping, once the shchita has been completed, it's considered shechted, it's considered dead. Now, for an Ovid Kochavim, however, in terms of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, one of them being Ever Min Achai, you're not allowed to eat Ever Min Achai, so they don't have the halachas of shchita. They don't have a concept of trachea and esophagus and 50%. They just need to kill their animals, their meat, before they can eat it. So they have to wait until it's done flipping and it's done flopping, so that they know that it's dead, because there's no other criteria there. I'm going to chop a sluk of tea. Okay, so now if you have a scenario where hashoichet, a yid, does a proper shchita, behema tmeya, but it's on a non-kosher animal, like let's say a hog, le'ovid kochavim, for an ovid kochavim. So you have a yid, it's doing a proper shchita, but a non-kosher animal for an ovid kochavim. So in that case, since it is a proper shchita by a yid, but it's mifarkeses, it's still flipping, it's still flopping, so you wouldn't be able to eat it yet, but at that point, it would already be considered ochel in terms of tumas ochlin. So again, the ovid kochavim wouldn't be allowed to eat it yet, because the ovid kochavim needs to wait until it stops flipping and stops flopping. However, it would already be considered at that point, while it's flipping and while it's flopping, it would already be considered ochel in terms of being able to contract and convey tumas ochlin. Mitama tumas ochlin, it can contract and convey tumas ochlin, avalo tumas nevelos, but it would not yet be considered tumas nevelos achetomos until it is fully dead. So that's another o achiyatis is rosha, or until you entirely sever its, decapitated. Then it would be considered fully dead, and it would be considered nevela. So there is another example where something would be considered tumas ochlin, but not tumas nevela, i.e. a yid who shechts a hog for an ovid kochavim, and the hog is flipping and the hog is flopping. So it would be at that point already shaykh to tumas ochlin, but not yet tumas nevela until it calms down. Riba letami tumas ochlin, mimashe riba letami tumas nevelos, and as we have demonstrated, there is a broader scope of things that would be considered tumas ochlin than there are for things that are considered tumas nevela. Rebuta omis is rebuta ha'olo. When it comes to this olo that we haven't exactly explained what it is, we're deferring that to the Gemara. Hamechunas, that is gathered, im yesh bo kazayis b'makom echad. If there's a kazayis in one place, chayiv olav, you would be chayiv for it. I think for what? So Rashi says im naga v'nichnas lamikdash, right? If you're tamei, right? Lovato chashuv abasa nevela v'chayiv olav naga v'nichnas lamikdash o achol kodesh. Right. So we're saying kazayis, that would be nevela. But again, we're in the Gemara, we're going to get more into this olol and understand what it is. But it can be considered nevela at a kazayis, and you would be chayiv for tumas mikdash v'kodashov. But again, we'll understand that better once we understand what an olol is, friends. That was Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Chullin, we wrapped up the 8th perek of Masechta Chullin, perek Kol HaBasar. We learned the final Mishnah comparing chelev and blood. We said in some ways chelev is more stringent than blood, i.e. when it comes to mi'ila, pigol nosavetame, and in some ways blood is more stringent than chelev, in that blood applies to behemoths, chayas, oves, kosher, not kosher, whereas chelev is specifically kosher animals. And then we kind of worked those out in the Gemaras, and we wrapped up the 8th parak of Masechta Chullin. We then began the 9th parak, Parak Ha'or Ve'Harotev. We had a little bit of a introduction to Parak Ha'or Ve'Harotev, which talks about Tumas Ochlin and Tumas Nevelos. We talked about Hechsher Tumas Ochlin by coming in contact with water before it can contract Tumas Ochlin. The minimum shear for contracting Tumas Ochlin, which is any amount transmitting Tumas Ochlin, you need a kebeya. And we talked about having a peel, a shomer, and a yad, a handle like a stem for Ochlin as well. And we learned the first Mishnah of Parak Ha'or Ve'Harotev that discussed different things that can join together with food to make a kebeya for transmitting tuma, and they would not, however, join together with meat to make nevela. Friends, that was Daf Kuv Yud Zayin, Daf 117 of Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.